On today's episode, John is joined by Avi Loeb. Avi Loeb is the former chair of the astronomy department at Harvard University, founding director of Harvard's Black Hole Initiative, and director of the Institute for Theory and Computation at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He also chairs the board on physics and astronomy at the National Academies and the advisory board for the Breakthrough Starshot Project. He is a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Loeb is the best-selling author of Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth.
Dr. Avi Loeb, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Doctor, we have had space in the news, in the pop culture, in a rather odd way as of late. The UAP UFO phenomenon, where purportedly the U.S. government, its Navy ships, and are seeing something, pilots seeing something. And a government report is due out later this month that indications say they're going to say that they don't know what they are. They are unidentified, which these objects have been reported for many decades, and we still don't know what they are after 70 or more years. In fact, I think, as I recall, you were a successor of an early scientific researcher in the field, Donald Menzel at Harvard. But we still don't know anything more than we did during his day. How are we going to identify the unidentified?
Yes, so the big news of this report would be the statement that these real objects, because the first thing you would worry about that there may be smudges on the cameras or illusions of the pilots or some malfunction of the instruments being used. And if the report states that these are real objects, that's a very important statement, because then it means that there could be several interpretations, only several, only three. One is that these objects belong to another nation, they are human-made, and of course that's a serious national security concern. So the fact that the report is being released implies to me that they are not made by other nations, because otherwise the government would keep the information classified and act accordingly. National security interests would forbid releasing the information, because you want to know how to protect the country and you don't want to know your adversaries what you know. So the fact that the government releases information and says these are real objects means to me that they are not likely to belong to other nations. Okay, so that possibility can be crossed off for the kind of objects that will be discussed in the report. Okay, of course it could be a mixed bag. There could be many more unidentified objects, some with mundane explanations, but it's enough, I should say, that one of them comes from an extraterrestrial origin to trigger huge interest about the implications. So we don't need more than one that is extraterrestrial to start discussing it extensively. So there are some that are real, and they probably do not belong to other nations. And the reason for that may be that they behave in a way that does not match the limits of our technology. So we pretty much know what the limits of our technology, because in the US we know what these limits are, and then if there were technologies far more advanced in other countries, we would see signatures of them either in the consumer market or in the battlefield. Those countries would use the technologies they developed to gain advantage relative to other nations. And so we have a good sense of, roughly speaking, what the limits are of our technologies everywhere on the globe. And if these objects behave differently, there are two possibilities that remain on the table. One is that they are natural objects, that somehow nature makes objects that behave this way, and we have to figure it out. The second is that they are extraterrestrial. They originated from another civilization that is capable of manufacturing technologies far more advanced than we can fully understand right now. Sort of like the impression that the caveman would get when faced with a cell phone. The caveman would initially say, oh, maybe it's a natural rock, but then and just shiny, but then the caveman would start pressing the buttons and realize that no, it's something else. So we might be facing something like that, or these objects are natural. And of course, the way to figure it out is straightforward. Once you get to that point, the objects move from the realm of government, because they are not a national security risk, to the realm of science, where you can use open data. So instead of relying on classified information from the past, that obviously the government doesn't want us to see in full because it was derived from sensors that are classified. The government doesn't want the adversaries to know about all the sensors that we have. So forget about it. Let's just collect new data from the same geographical locations by deploying the best cameras we have access to right now, which are far better than used in the past, and the audio sensors, and just deploy them in the same locations and collect data just like in a scientific experiment. And this data will be open because the sky is not classified. You can look at the sky as much as you want, and we will analyze the data scientifically. And I'm very much willing to lead such an experiment that will clear up the fog. It's very unhealthy, the situation where the government makes some statements that are inconclusive, and then the scientific community dismisses the possibility of an extraterrestrial origin, and then the public is left to speculate. That's not a healthy situation. Let's collect more data scientifically and clear up the fog.
You have written extensively, along with others, about technosignatures. And one technosignature is some kind of a physical artifact in the solar system, and indeed Oumuamua. This would introduce something interesting into this mix, because if you have such artifacts in the solar system, and you have an active one, it could print out probes, and they could probe the atmosphere of Earth, and people might see them, and voila, you have UFOs. Therefore, we do actually have a plausible way within science for these things to actually be alien craft. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, there is definitely a possibility. We just have to keep in mind that we have been broadcasting radio waves for more than a century. So these signals that we sent out into space reached more than 100 light years by now. And if there is any civilization with radio telescopes of the type that we have, they may know about us already. And then the question is, how quickly will they respond? And, it will take them 1 million years to reach us if they used chemical rockets of the type that we used, like Voyager or New Horizons. But they might use faster propulsion methods, or they may have decided a long time ago, 1 billion years ago, that they want to examine the habitable zones around sun-like stars. And they send probes to each and every interesting target, including the sun, which has the Earth near it. And these probes are routinely monitoring what's going on here and relaying the information back. So that is a possibility. And if they thought about it a long time ago, they definitely had the opportunity to send those probes, even at low speeds, even at the characteristic speeds of stars and chemical rockets. They would make it across the galaxy in a relatively short time, and compared to the age of the sun, for example. So it's quite possible that we are being visited or were visited. I mean, it's not excluded by any physical principle. And the best way to figure it out is by not having a prejudice. If we say we know the answer in advance without collecting data, then we are fooling ourselves. We are just like the philosophers that refused to look through Galileo's telescope because they knew that the sun moves around the Earth. And Galileo, who looked through his telescope, realized that's probably not the case. And of course, what they accomplished, these philosophers, is maintaining their ignorance. We can close down the curtains on our windows and say we don't have neighbors. But the existence of neighbors does not depend on whether we look through the windows or not. And therefore, it's the obligation of scientists to be open-minded, to look through the windows, to check if we have neighbors without a prejudice.
One thing piqued my interest particularly about what you said is a threat to national security. So could an alien civilization being present in our own star system, wouldn't that automatically be a question of national security? Or are you just looking at something so powerful that you couldn't respond with any means?
Well, it's not a matter of national security, it may be a matter of international security, because it's not one particular nation that is at risk here, it's the entire human species, potentially. And whether it's at risk or not depends on the intent of the senders of those objects. And we don't know what the intent was. And by the way, even if it looks peaceful and quite innocent, just keep in mind the story about the Trojan horse that looked innocent and led to quite severe consequences. So what appears innocent and not so harmful might end up being quite a significant risk. So we should keep that always in mind. And we have no evidence or no way of figuring out the intent without getting more data. And I think the key is not to have a prejudice, to collect as much evidence as possible and move this subject from the government to the scientific sector. And it's not a trivial matter, I should say, because, well, first of all, the data was classified for national security reasons, and that's why the process was delayed. But moreover, there is a huge resistance within the scientific community of discussing it. There is a taboo on discussing it. And, I wrote the recent book, Extraterrestrial. It received a huge reception from the general public, became a bestseller instantly. But the scientific community still has a hard time discussing it openly. The possibility that perhaps the first interstellar object we have seen, Oumuamua, was a technological relic. And I just say, let's put it on the table because it looked so weird. Didn't look like a comet or an asteroid that we have seen before. Nevertheless, there is a huge resistance and very strong emotional response of scientists to this possibility. Whereas people are willing to discuss options for the nature of dark matter that are highly speculative. We have no evidence for them. Nevertheless, they don't feel threatened by the dark matter being something highly speculative, but they are feeling a strong emotional connection to the possibility that we might not be the smartest kid on the block. That threatens the ego of every human. It's just like, my daughters when they were young and we brought them to the kindergarten, they had a psychological shock on the first day in kindergarten because they finally, for the first time, realize that there are kids that might be smarter than they are. And they would have preferred to stay at home and maintain the illusion that they are the smartest in the whole world. But reality is different, and whether you ignore it or not doesn't really matter.
Now, on a related subject, because this would eventually become relevant if one of these things were of alien origin, that is communications with it, METI. Messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. What are your views on that? Should we do it, or should we really try to play it safe, especially if the aliens are close?
Well, when you walk in the wilderness, you better be quiet, because you never know whether there are predators out there. And so I would adopt the same strategy here, and first of all, try to figure out the most I can about anyone else in space. And the best approach would be for us to learn as much as possible about these objects or other objects or signals that we get and try to interpret them. And as you say, it's a challenge to figure out what the meaning behind them is. It was a challenge with the Trojan horse, and it's even more of a challenge when you have a conversation, if you get a signal, because then it's similar to Alan Turing's challenge of decoding the Enigma code during the Second World War. That was a major challenge, and he eventually figured it out. And the same applies to any language that you don't fully understand. And moreover, we are used to communicating using, for example, sound waves as we speak to each other. It's possible that the means of communication are quite different for creatures that were born on a planet that had no connection to Earth, that developed technologies that are far removed from what we develop. And that's why it's a fishing expedition. We can't forecast what kind of a fish we will get. It could be a fish that we've never seen before.
Which brings up Earth because of the just enormous diversity in bioforms on this planet, from fish all the way to birds to humans, all communicating differently. So just Earth alone creates an issue there as far as communications.
Right.
Gets much worse with an alien that has no connection to you at all.
Yeah, just to give you an example, most stars are smaller than the sun. The sun is not a typical star, so most of them are dwarf stars. And for example, the nearest star to us is Proxima Centauri. It's 12% of the mass of the sun, has roughly half the surface temperature of the sun. So it emits mostly infrared light. And if there are any creatures on the habitable planet near it, Proxima b, they must have infrared eyes, very different from the eyes that we have. So I asked students in my class, the freshman seminar, if they know of any creatures on Earth that have infrared eyes. And one of them Googled it and found a shrimp that has infrared eyes, and they look like ping pong balls connected with cords to the head of the shrimp. It did look like an alien to me, but it's still, a creature we find here on Earth, and who knows how these things look like elsewhere. And this is just a matter of vision that we are talking about. But think about intelligent creatures that develop a language of their own, how different they could be from us.
Or, even in science, there's no guarantee that they would choose base 10 mathematics or something like that. So they may have a different interpretation, right?
Definitely. And, we are born into this world like actors put on a stage. And the one thing we notice after studying the universe is the stage is huge. We are not at the center of it, like the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle argued. And people believed him for 1,000 years because it flattered their ego to believe that we are the center of the world. So we know that the stage is like 10 to the power 26 times bigger than the size of our body. It's huge. And the other thing we know is that the play was going on for 13.8 billion years, much before we came to exist. And clearly the play is not about us. But what we can do is find other actors and ask them whether they have a better sense of what the play is about. Perhaps they will have insights that we currently don't have.
Now, motivations of an alien civilization to actually come here. The bottom line really is that our solar system is made of the same stuff that the entire galaxy is made out of. So they don't need gold. They're going to have that closer. They don't need water. Water is just ridiculously common. So there seems to me to only be one reason to come here, and that would be life on Earth, this interesting exoplanet. If we found something that looked like Earth, we would do everything we could to study it. So might that be the basic motivation for an alien civilization to come here? And it's worth noting, too, that this planet has shown a biosignature, essentially, for a very, very long time, far longer than a technosignature.
Right.
So do you think that would be the reason that they would come here?
Well, that's one possibility, but also, if it's possible they planted some forms of life here on Earth and they want to see what comes out of those seeds. We don't know what their intent or motivation is, but my guess is we are not dealing with living creatures that come and visit us or collecting necessarily the data. It could be, we are developing now artificial intelligence, and within a century, it may overtake our ability as, biological creatures. And just think about robots, tiny robots that can self-replicate and produce other robots of the same type. And they can survive for billions of years, unlike biological creatures. And it's hard to tell what the agenda, what the long-term goal of these robots is, but I can imagine equipment that has its own life that is very long and has its own agenda of visiting stars and figuring out things about stars and manipulating what happens on habitable planets in ways that we cannot now comprehend. But I think instead of speculating, let's just be spectators. Let's observe and try to see what these things are and if they exist, and rather than guessing ahead of time, because maybe as we collect more data, more evidence, it will become clear.
Actually looking for them. Now, you've mentioned cameras and looking at them, looking for them that way, but people are going to say in the comments, what about radar? Because sometimes these things are reported to appear, on radar. So it would seem to me that would be a really straightforward way to try to determine if this phenomenon is atmospheric or if it was actually a solid object.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the government does have radar data on some of the objects, and that's what makes them appear real, because they were detected in multiple instruments, radars, infrared cameras, and visible light cameras, and then pilots that saw them, many different pilots at the same time. So that gives confidence they are real objects, and presumably there might be some satellite data on the bigger objects. But my point is that a physicist looking at these objects would approach them differently than military personnel, because if I were to examine these objects and try to collect more data on them or evidence, what I would look for example, is if an object moves faster than the speed of sound in air, there should be a sonic boom, a shock wave generated, just the same way that a supersonic plane produces a sonic boom. And there might be signatures of that, either in the images or the infrared signature of the object, because it will heat up. I would like to see the byproducts of the motion, not just to see the motion being supersonic, but to see the evidence that indeed this supersonic motion results in the standard phenomena that we are familiar with, because any physical object of some cross-section moving faster than sound in air will produce a shockwave. We want to see that. And then when it goes through water, there should be a splash that will tell us something about the size of the object, the properties of the... So in principle, with scientific data that is sufficiently rich, you can learn much more than just saying, oh, there is something that looks like a tic-tac or something that looks like this and that, which is pretty much what the pilots were talking about. So instead of qualitative discussions, I would like to have quantitative discussions that from the point of view of scientists. And for that, you need first scientists to be engaged, involved in the process. So I'm volunteering to be part of the discussion. And as long as the people that have the data would appoint an appropriate committee or forum that can analyze existing data, or to collect new data that will be open to the public.
One thing that seems to have changed with this whole thing is that it used to be you never knew where the UFO was going to show up. It was just spotted by people, and then we would hear anecdotes about it. Now they seem to cluster around Navy ships, and they seem to do it a lot. That would seem to me to provide a natural point to start of knowing where to look, right?
Well, so there could be two possible natural reasons for this clustering that you point out. One is if it were another nation trying to spy on military facilities, you would naturally find those objects near the military facilities, okay? Another possible explanation is these are the regions that where the sensors that monitor the sky are concentrated. You just don't have such sensors in Disneyland, right? Or in New York City. And that's why we don't see as many weird objects there. I mean, people may use their cell phones to take photographs, but they do not monitor the sky in the same way that the military sensors do. And so you naturally find the evidence around military constellations because that's where the sky is being monitored very frequently. And these are the two simple explanations. Otherwise, you might say, oh, maybe that implies a certain intent. If indeed you monitor other regions, geographical locations, and you don't find such unusual phenomena, and you find them only around nuclear reactors, around military facilities, then it means something about the intent of those objects.
And that's where it gets scary. Why would an alien civilization be taking account of our nuclear capabilities? Not sure I want to think about that one too much. Now, so in principle, the way to start would just simply pick a suitable area, set up sensors, and it doesn't have to be anywhere special, just wherever convenient, and just monitor the skies for X amount of time and gain a sample, essentially.
Right.
And if you don't see that, then you need to stick it on a Navy ship, basically, right?
Yeah, and someone may ask, oh, we are monitoring the sky with astronomical facilities. We have telescopes looking at the sky. But I should clarify that even survey telescopes that are monitoring the sky and looking for transients, things that change over time. And there are some facilities. One of them is Pan-STARRS that monitor the sky and discovered Oumuamua, the first interstellar object. It's located in Hawaii, this telescope. And there will be a successor to it, which will be much more sensitive, called the Vera Rubin Observatory, that will start its operation in a couple of years in Chile. So one thing to understand is that these astronomical facilities, these telescopes, focusing on very distant sources of light. And if there is something moving in our atmosphere very quickly above our head, they are not designed to look for those. I mean, these might be interpreted as satellites moving through the image or some other things, or maybe an airplane. So if you see something like that, the astronomers would ignore it. But if you do a survey which is focused nearby objects, as should be in the case of unidentified flying objects or unidentified aerial phenomena, then you're targeting a completely different data set. And that's my proposal.
The scientist that discovers evidence of an alien civilization, which could come from the UAP phenomenon, we don't know, is probably going to win a Nobel Prize. Given that, why do you think that there has been such a taboo against the subject that's been ingrained for many years now in science?
Well, it's a high-risk, high-reward proposition, but frankly, the Nobel Prize is not worth much in the big scheme of things. If you think about it, it's awarded by humans to humans for figuring out something that we never realized before. And even though for us it would be a big revelation, in terms of the ocean of knowledge that there is out there, it may be a very trivial fact, that other civilizations know about much more. So, I mean, we have our science developed over the past century, and we should realize that it's just an island of knowledge in an ocean of ignorance, and there is so much we don't know. We don't even know what most of the matter in the universe is. We don't know what was there before the Big Bang. We don't have a quantum theory of gravity that works. And there are lots of things that we don't even know how to ask. And so I would pretty much say that we should be modest. And getting the Nobel Prize is really not very significant in the big scheme of things. It's true that such a revelation would be more significant than the discovery that the Earth moves around the sun, because it has huge implications. It would change the way we view our place in the universe. If we are not the smartest kid on the block, there is something we can learn from others. And it would change our religious beliefs. It would change the way the international relations we have, because we are all part of the human species, and they are out there and they are different. And it would change a lot of things, and there is no bigger scientific question. Now, at the same time, because it's such a high reward discovery, there is a huge amount of skepticism among scientists, because Some of them are reluctant to move away from their comfort zone, from things they already know, and anything that they see is interpreted in terms of what we already know. So that's conservatism. At the same time, there is huge interest from the public, and some of the statements made about UFOs are not substantiated by any scientific facts, and so the scientists say we don't want any part of it because there is some nonsense being said out there. But just think about the human body. There were people saying that it has a soul about 1,000 years ago. And just imagine if scientists would say, we don't want to do any anatomy because the human body may have a soul and it's a controversial subject. Where would modern medicine be? I think scientists have an obligation to address controversial subjects and shed some light on them, clear up the fog. If there is evidence and serious people find or document evidence for unidentified objects and they are not human-made because otherwise they would be national security threat, then scientists should get into the picture and clarify their nature. And this is as important and much more important than finding out the nature of dark matter.
And it has to be said here, too, that an inquiry into this, of the type that you're proposing, has other benefits. What if these are some sort of atmospheric phenomenon, a natural phenomenon that we were unaware of until now? And such an effort would collect data on atmospheric phenomena that could be mistaken for UFOs. So you would see the mirages of Venus and all that sort of thing. So you could actually start to characterize how common those kinds of phenomena are as well, right?
Yeah, so we will learn something new no matter what, because it's something we didn't expect. And so it's a win-win proposition. If you see something anomalous, something strange, actually it's a great thing. You shouldn't feel that it shakes you out of your comfort zone. It's an opportunity to learn something new, which is all that motivates science to make new discoveries. And nobody expected quantum mechanics a century ago. It was brought upon us by experiments that we did not anticipate, and we learn new things. Science is a learning experience, and we should have this childhood curiosity in us as scientists, rather than assume that we know already the answers in advance. Be open-minded. When a kid looks at an object, the kid turns it around and you think that the kid is playing with it, but in fact the kid is trying to learn about it. An adult looking at the object would look at it from one direction and say, oh, I pretty much know what's on the other side. I don't want to spend the effort, and therefore nothing unusual will be found. If you are not willing to find wonderful things, you will never discover them.
Now, in regards to the numbers, if they're hypothetically, let's say you find something and we're able to determine that it's of alien origin, having an alien civilization present in your own atmosphere that close would tend to suggest that alien civilizations are extremely common, correct?
Not necessarily, because over 1 billion years you can pretty much fill up the Milky Way galaxy with probes. If they are intentional, you don't just send them randomly in different directions. You target the habitable zones around stars, and then you don't need as many probes as if you were to send them randomly. If they hone on this particular region around stars where life may exist, then and they can self-replicate, you could pretty much fill up the galaxy around, send a probe to almost every star and learn about the whereabouts of life there, and even monitor what is happening in real time. And for that, you just need one very advanced civilization that was able to spread out. Just think about the Europeans that sent ships initially for commercial reasons to, let's say, Africa to get commodities, but then ended up finding the new world in the Americas. And we now have Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk for commercial reasons, advertising space exploration, but they may send up ships into space that will eventually end up discovering new worlds in much the same way. So you start the journey with some motivation, but if you get equipment that is self-sufficient and can reproduce itself, then you can pretty much fill up the galaxy in 1 billion years.
Now, we'll come back to that, but we have something big on the horizon regarding this subject, the report that is mandated to come out, I believe, on June 25th. What do you expect from the report, and do you expect a lot of it's not going to be very interesting and that most of the good stuff will be classified?
Yeah, I think the data that will be released will be just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason is simple. The data was collected by sensors that are classified. We don't want our adversaries, other nations, to know the array of sensors we have and the kind of data that we get routinely by monitoring our sky. And at the same time, some people have access to that data. And when I hear high-level officials like former President Obama or former CIA directors, John Brennan and John Woolsey, speaking about these as real objects, when they had access to the classified data, that lends confidence that we have this iceberg of which we just see the tip, that supports the notion that these are real objects. Because these politicians or administrators are serious people. You know, they would not express themselves in this way. So that's what lends credibility to the notion that we have much more data than is revealed to the public, and the objects might be real. And I think that is the most important statement, that these are real objects, and at the same time probably not human-made, because they maneuver in ways that far supersede our technology. Now, it's possible that another nation developed things that are far ahead of us, but that would be a major intelligence problem because we haven't figured out that they are doing it. And so I would guess that we pretty much know what other nations are doing, and therefore these cannot be human-made. And if that's the case, as we discussed before, we will learn something new, whether they are made by nature or whether they are extraterrestrial. And to me, that's very exciting, and I'm very interested in finding out more about these objects.
Well, I think most of the public would echo that. I think there's been huge interest in the UFO phenomenon among just the general population, even though very little among science. But now seems to be the time to sort of merge the two and get to the bottom of it finally, and be able to say, okay, we know what the unidentified flying objects are. And as you said, it very well, almost likely that it will be a mixed bag. But maybe one of those options is an alien civilization.
Yeah, it's enough to have one object. We don't need more than one that we identify as extraterrestrial. And I discussed one object that is a candidate, which is Oumuamua in my book, Extraterrestrial. But of course, among the UAP, there could be one or more. And they, of course, are closer to us, and we should therefore monitor them more closely. And I think it's about time now that this subject would move out of the classified data set of the government into the open data set of scientists. So let's move it from government to science. And I think then everything will be transparent. The public will be able to know what we know. There wouldn't be any issues with sensors that are classified and therefore data not being available, because we will use cameras that you can buy in stores, and the scientists will just collect data and release it and analyze it in a transparent way, just the way scientific experiments are done. I think that's the healthy approach to this subject.
One also wonders what you could do with satellites. I would imagine in that classified data set, there's probably satellite footage of these things. So given that, could a public satellite be, just a CubeSat or something, be put in orbit and put to use trying to spot these things from low Earth orbit?
Potentially, yes, but it needs to be equipped with a big enough lens, a big enough telescope, so that it can resolve objects that are rather small from a great distance. And obviously there are spy satellites of that type that are, getting footage of buildings and even perhaps humans or vehicles that are the size of these objects that are talked about. So that is definitely possible technologically, but you need to invest. If you want to do it in a non-military context, you need the investment of funds in satellites that will monitor the ground. Usually, astronomers are looking up, not down. And so this would be a scientific experiment that is quite different from what astronomers are used to. You will take a telescope and point it down rather than up.
But, given what you're looking for, you can cover a lot of ground with a satellite.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Now, what do you think the likelihood is of this actually having an alien origin? That just one UFO being of alien origin. Does that seem likely to you that it could be, or do you think it's highly unlikely, but we have to check it out anyway?
Well, it's definitely possible. We know that about half of the sun-like stars have a planet roughly the size of the Earth at roughly the same separation. We know it from the Kepler satellite data. And that means that not only that we are not at the center of the universe, but also what we find in our backyard is very common, the Earth-Sun system. There are tens of billions like them in the Milky Way galaxy alone. And most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun. So if they hosted a technological civilization that predated us by billions of years, these technological civilizations had plenty of time to send probes that will visit a planetary system like the solar system and could replicate themselves and visit us. And, it's not completely outrageous to think that even Oumuamua, the unusual interstellar object that we discovered in 2017, was on a reconnaissance mission that was trying to collect data from probes that already existed in our vicinity. And perhaps there was a predecessor to that Oumuamua object that distributed those probes ahead of time, and we just didn't detect it because it visited us before the Pan-STARRS survey looked at the sky, and decades ago. And if these probes are around and they collect data, and every now and then there might be a receiver that is passing by, and perhaps that's why Oumuamua had a very flat shape and thin shape. It was a receiver rather than a light sail or something else. So everything is possible, but the way to make progress is to collect more data.
This brings up another thing you've done work on. So say we find the one UFO that's of alien origin. Then we get to ask ourselves, where are they from? And one possibility is that they are from a nearby exoplanet, such as Proxima b, which means we should turn our telescopes and look for evidence of technology, right?
Well, it's quite unlikely that they come from the nearest star, because if you just look at Earth, we developed radio communication and our technologies over the past century, and that's a small fraction of the age of the Earth. And if you imagine a similar window of opportunity around Proxima Centauri, then that means that it's very unlikely that we are witnessing it right now, because it's only one part in 100 million of the age of the star. And so what's the chance that that short window of opportunity is available to us just as this star is passing close to us? Most likely, if we ever catch a star to have technological abilities similar to ours, it will be far away. And so you need the 100 million stars before you would get one of them to show it if the chance is 1 in 100 million. So that would argue that is called the Copernican principle, basically saying that we don't live at a privileged time. Copernicus argued that we don't reside or we are not located at a privileged place. We're not at the center of the universe. And you can generalize it to a privileged time, and that would imply that Proxima Centauri is not likely to have a technological civilization like ours right now, but who knows? So the thing about Oumuamua, for example, is that it originated in a frame of reference that is called the local standard of rest, which is the average of the motions of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. And so none of the nearby stars is at rest in that frame, and Oumuamua was at rest. Only 1 in 500 stars is so much at rest as Oumuamua was. And that means that it didn't originate from any of those stars. And but that's just one object. Who knows? I would very much approach this subject like a fisherman going for a fishing expedition, and without any assumptions of what the hook will find.
The implications of finding a distant alien civilization through SETI and finding one in your own star system seems to me to be a little bit different, because if you've got distance, you also have time. So you see some technosignature 1,500 light years away. It's from the past, and it's just too far away to reasonably expect as, communication even. But if you got one in your star system, you open up direct contact with that alien civilization. So if we wanted to establish, say it landed and it 3D printed out an alien that says, take me to your leader. First contact, what do you think the prudent way to handle that would be?
Well, first to listen rather than speak, and try to interpret the meaning behind the communication signal we get. That would be extremely important. I should say that the search strategy we had in the past is misguided. We looked for radio signals coming from the directions of other stars, and this is just like trying to have a phone conversation. You need the counterpart to be alive. But if you imagine those distant cultures being similar to the cultures we had on Earth, most of the civilizations or cultures that existed on Earth are dead by now. But we find evidence for them in archaeological digs through the relics they left behind. So a much better approach is to do space archaeology, search for relics left behind, equipment that was sent into space, especially self-replicating probes. That would likely be the dominant kind of objects we will find. And just to remind you, the electronic equipment is much more durable than biological creatures, because it can survive the hazardous environment of space much better and can last for billions of years in principle. So my guess is that we will first encounter equipment. Perhaps the equipment has artificial intelligence as part of it, but it will not be biological. So the contact will not be with living creatures. If I had to guess, it would be more with sophisticated, very advanced technological equipment.
Which opens up a really sad possibility of having functioning alien equipment collecting data on Earth and beaming it back to an extinct alien civilization.
Yeah, that is frustrating for us, because we want ourselves to be known, famous, also on the galactic scale, not just in Hollywood. But on the other hand, it may be better if those aliens that send the equipment had negative thoughts about what they want to do with the information. It's better that they're not around, for us. So we first have to figure out the intent of the senders before we decide whether it's to our benefit or not to have them alive.
Which could be very beneficial to us. I usually, and I'll get to this in a bit, I usually tend to be a little bit negative on first contact scenarios. But in this case, if you had an alien probe that's been sitting out there collecting data on Earth for millions of years, it has a gift for you. It could come back and say, hello, first contact, here is a record of the entire natural history of your planet.
It could also tell us what the dark matter is, what was there before the Big Bang, how to unify quantum mechanics and gravity. For me, that would save us a lot of time. And you might say each of these bits of information could have won a Nobel Prize, but who cares? It might feel like cheating in an exam where you look over the shoulders of a student next to you to figure out the answer. But if it saves you 1,000,000 years, I'm very much for it. And moreover, there is no teacher that is grading us, right? So as students, it's beneficial for us to know the answer and save the 1,000,000 years in the process.
That would be absolutely amazing if SETI picked up a radio signal and by some miracle was able to translate it, and it turns out to be a quantum theory of gravity, alien civilization telling everybody the answer to the biggest problem in physics.
Yeah, but it may not be a radio signal. It could be a piece of equipment that we find. And just imagine another object like Oumuamua being discovered by Pan-STARRS or by the Vera Rubin Observatory in the more distant future, and us being alerted to it a year in advance. And as a result, we send a spacecraft equipped with a camera, and we take a close-up photograph and see that it is a technological relic rather than a rock. And then we decide to have a mission similar to OSIRIS-REx that landed on the asteroid Bennu and collected a sample that will be returned to Earth in 2023. So just imagine landing on a piece of equipment, and first of all, we might read off the label, made on planet X. And second, we might import the technology back to Earth. That could be worth a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. If you had a piece of alien technology in your hands, then you are automatically ahead of the other nation states.
Right. It would feel like holding a cell phone long before it's released to the public and playing with its features.
Now, as a scientist, say we were able to recover parts of a UAP and they were anomalous, and there have been reports that this might be the case, that Lockheed Martin, according to Harry Reid, or Bigelow Aerospace, according to ATIP, I suppose, have these materials. Where do you start in analyzing them and trying to differentiate them from Earth materials?
No, I think scientists should look at whatever hardware is being identified. And I should say that we have a pretty good sense of which elements are possible within the standard model of physics, because elements that are not found in nature are thought to be unstable, and it would be a huge revelation if a deviation from the standard model of physics, if there were other elements that are stable but we've never encountered. And I should say any deviation from the laws of physics, even a slight one, would be a Nobel Prize. So, it shouldn't be taken lightly to argue that maybe these deviate from what we know about physics, because even a slight deviation, and by the way, physicists are searching for slight deviations in accelerators, even the muon magnetic moment deviating slightly from what might have been expected, and that's still being debated, could imply new physics. And just to remind you, for decades, we haven't found new physics in accelerators. We pretty much confirmed what we already knew. And so, physics is a very mature subject, and there is a huge body of data that seems to conform with what we define as the standard model of physics. And if we were to find an object behaving differently, then it would be big news, even as big as finding aliens, in the sense that here is something fundamental we missed about nature, about the laws of physics. And that's more important than aliens, because the laws of physics affect the entire universe. It's not just a local phenomenon. It's something we missed that is presumably has other implications elsewhere in the universe. And that would be dramatic.
Now, question regarding that dark matter. We still don't know what it is. So is it still open that we have found a deviation in gravity?
Oh, yeah. So there are anomalies. There are things that don't match up what we already know. But what people say, what scientists say, again, in order to stay in their comfort zone, they say, okay, there is another type of particle. We can extend the standard model of physics so that there would be other types of particles, and it really depends what are the properties of that particle. But people came up with scenarios where you don't modify the standard model too much, you just extend it in a way that would allow other types of particles to exist, but they don't have any significant implication for our lives on Earth, because these particles are very weakly interacting with ordinary matter, and they pretty much have only a big influence on objects like galaxies or clusters of galaxies, things that do not really matter in our daily life. But of course, we have to keep in mind that we wouldn't exist if the dark matter didn't exist, because the seeds for everything we see around us came from early in the universe, and they were carried by the dark matter. All the small inhomogeneities in the universe survived in the dark matter sector, but did not survive in the ordinary matter sector because it was coupled to the cosmic microwave background, and that smoothed out all the inhomogeneities. So in a sense, the dark matter is important for our cosmic roots, but it's not important for our daily lives today.
Now, my last question for you, Doctor, this time. So we seem to have the public interest and the interest of Congress and a lot of politicians, Marco Rubio, etc., to get to the bottom of this. What is the first steps that need to be taken to create a proper scientific inquiry into the UFO UAP phenomenon?
I think there should be a scientific forum established that is composed of scientists, not military personnel, not politicians, not administrators, but scientists that approach this subject from a scientific perspective, as if they were tasked to design an experiment, basically using the instruments that we have at our disposal now to shed more light on this phenomenon and figure it out. And of course, there would be many scientists that would not participate in this because they think they know the answer. But I'm one of those scientists that are very curious, and I'll be glad to lead such a forum and collect more evidence. And when you collect evidence with instrumentation that is available commercially and just analyze that kind of a data without requesting access to classified data, then the process will be completely transparent to the public. And I think it's an opportunity to gain the confidence of the public in evidence-based science. I mean, we saw one incarnation of that through the vaccines that were developed. The messenger RNA vaccine was a synthetic chemical produced in a laboratory. It was not a weakened virus. And that shows that understanding the virus, scientific understanding of the virus, led to a chemical that was produced artificially, that basically produced the desired immune response, which is a celebration of modern science. You know, when we understand something, we can solve the problem. And so right now, when the Pentagon report comes out, there will be a problem. What are these objects? And why don't we let science shed more light and answer this question, solve this problem? And I think that's the obvious next step. And what you need is a relatively modest funding for experiments that will clarify the nature of unidentified aerial phenomena. And I'm willing to be engaged in that wholeheartedly.
And we are live. I'm so excited today. I've got an amazing guest for you with over 900 scientific papers, 8 books, and 3 decades of Ivy League experience. Avi Loeb is at the top of his game in the astronomy and astrophysics worlds. By one quantitative metric that scientists and scholars use to measure their success, the H index, a value of a 12 is considered good enough to secure university tenure. 20, a sign of notable success. 40, representative of an outstanding scientist. Avi Loeb boasts an H index of 112. Avi, I hope I didn't embarrass you with that introduction.
Well, these labels do not impress me at the very least, because I'm still the farm boy. If you ask people that know me from a young age, they will tell you I haven't changed much. And, what really, we should keep our eyes on the ball, not on the audience here.
Absolutely. So speaking of keeping our eyes on the ball, the recent report was finally released from the Pentagon, specifically the preliminary assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Avi, I realize that this is a preliminary report and only a tiny piece of a much longer classified version, but what did you make of the scope of the report and how it was compiled from a scientific perspective of good data collection and analysis?
Well, first thing to understand is the report originated from concerns about national security. Of course, if we have objects flying in our sky, we need to understand where they come from, and that's why it was of interest to the military. It was of interest to Washington, D.C., the political system, and the fact that we see this report coming out in public implies two important things. First, that the report states that some of the objects appear to be real. And the reason they are believed to be real is because they were detected by radar systems, infrared sensors, optical cameras, and then multiple people seeing the same thing. And so you can't argue, like some people on Twitter argue, that it may be a smudge on the camera, it may be a malfunction of an instrument, it may be the illusions of some pilots. And by the way, these are people we trust for the defense of our country. So you can't just dismiss those serious people. And by the way, we put people in jail based on two eyewitnesses that testify that they saw something. So apparently our legal system does believe people when they come out and say, that's what I've seen. And so we should pay respect to those military personnel that talk about these incidents. And the other thing the report says is there was a stigma on discussing this subject because people were afraid of the taboo on the context of an extraterrestrial technology and so forth. And as a result, the number of reported incidents is far smaller than the actual number of events that took place. But the most important statement, as far as I'm concerned, is that some events are real, some objects are real. And also you see that some high-level officials, such as the former CIA directors Brennan and Woolsey and former President Barack Obama, were talking about these as a serious matter. And those people had access to the classified data, which I think is the iceberg. We just see the tip of the iceberg. So when people criticize the images that we see, they have to understand that there is much more data available, and it's not being released because it was collected by sensors that are owned by the US government, and those sensors are classified. And because of that, the data is classified. If you were to reveal all the data, it would basically tell our adversaries what kind of instruments we're using to monitor our sky. And obviously these instruments are of national security importance, so we don't want to do that. Now, here is a simple path forward. The data that was reported is intriguing enough, at least to me, to suggest that we move this subject away from the talking points of politicians or national security advisors or military personnel to the realm of science. It's sufficiently intriguing for scientists to look into it. And the sky in many geographical locations is not classified. We can look up and monitor the sky. So, and in fact, we don't need to use government-owned instruments. We can buy off-the-shelf cameras, connect them to wide-field telescopes, and feed the data that we get into state-of-the-art computers. And these instruments will be far more capable, actually, than what you find in airplanes. Because it's
designed for the purpose, right?
Yeah, the fighter jets were designed for combat situations. They were not really aimed at collecting scientific data on unidentified aerial phenomena. So the obvious step forward would be for scientists to take the charge and monitor the sky in those geographic locations or others and collect data that will be open to the public using scientific instruments that are far better than those used by the military, and analyze this data to figure out whether there is anything unusual. And if there is, let's just get a high resolution photograph of these phenomena. That will resolve the question. It's not a philosophical question of whether we are alone, whether there is a smarter kid on the block. It's not a subject for discussions on Twitter. It's basically getting a high resolution photograph so that we can see the screws on the object and figure out what it means. Now, if it turns out that it's human-made and it was made by Russia or China, and we haven't anticipated that, then it's clear that there is a national intelligence crisis, because we did not expect that. And we pretty much know the limits of our technologies, and we pretty much know the limits of other people's technologies, because if there was a technology far more advanced than we currently possess, it would find its way to the consumer market because you can make a huge profit out of it, or it will find itself in the battlefield, and we would see some signatures of that. So I highly doubt that there is something out there that is far better than we expect. And my point is, if these objects, these phenomena, behave in ways that far supersede our technological limits, and they are real objects, then there are two possibilities left. Either they are natural phenomena that we haven't anticipated, or they are extraterrestrial technologies. And both of these possibilities would be exciting. It's a win-win proposition. We will learn something new. So how can scientists ridicule this subject and say, let's forget about it, business as usual? That's the wrong thing to do. What we should do is organize a scientific project that will clear up the fog, that will tell the public what the nature of these objects is. Science in the 21st century can address such questions. We are not in the Middle Ages and Dark Ages where people had convictions and talked about miracles. We have scientific instruments that can tell us the nature of objects, and we can figure out what they are. And that will be a contribution of science to society, because a lot of people in the public are curious about this subject. And, just like science helped design a synthetic chemical that produces the desired immune response in the bodies of hundreds of millions of people and solve the COVID-19 problem with the mRNA
vaccine.
Science can also prove itself very useful to address this particular question that is of great interest to the public. And I'm very optimistic that if funding is allocated, we can do it. And in fact, I'm being contacted about the potential funding sources.
Well, Avi, if you're optimistic, I'm optimistic, and that makes me feel great. You said so many amazing things there, and I want to break some of those down. The first thing I want to break down is the debrief. Chris Plain with the debrief released a story today about one of the things that you mentioned. He spoke with a leading astrobiologist, Abel Mendez from the Planetary Habitability Lab, and he was quoted as saying, it's a moot point when asked about whether or not he would work with NASA or work with the government to begin to understand what we have, what we're looking at. He said it's a moot point unless NASA can get its hands on the classified UFO data held by the Pentagon. Are you concerned that the classified data will not be shared with scientists?
Well, I think it's the wrong approach altogether, because rather than obsess with classified data and argue with politicians, you have to understand politicians and military personnel, they're a different brand of people. It's just like going to shoemakers and saying, please bake me a cake. These people are not, do not have the education of scientists. They cannot really provide the answers for what we want to know. And I think what we should do is collect new data. I mean, science is about reproducibility of results. We don't need to rely on the government to tell us what we see in the sky. We can rely on the government on policy matters. That's very important, but not on objects that we see in the sky. That's ridiculous for us to dig into a fight with people that hold classified information about things appearing in our sky. We can look at the sky with scientific instruments. I mean, I just don't find this making any sense. And moreover, there are people reminiscing about the past and so forth. I would like to say that, UFOs are probably a mixed bag. There were lots of eyewitness testimonies that talked about seeing something unusual. Many of them have probably mundane explanations because people saw something that belongs to the military and they didn't know about it. So for them, it was unidentified. For the military, it was completely identified. So it doesn't vindicate all these claims of the past. When we see something in the sky, it doesn't say that all the previous reports about things in the sky are of value. And it doesn't really matter, because if we collect exceptional data, all we need is one object, just one object. I don't care about hundreds, thousands, or millions of objects that other people talked about. That is irrelevant. All we need is good data on one object, a high-resolution image or some other data that implies we are dealing with an object that doesn't behave the way our technologies allow, and that represents possibly an advanced technological equipment. And by the way, the most likely contact that we will ever have at first is probably with equipment. It's not with biological creatures the way you see in science fiction, because living organisms cannot survive the journey between stars. It's a very long journey. It takes 4 years for light to reach the nearest star to us, and it takes tens of thousands of years to traverse the galaxy for light. And most spaceships move, the spaceship we produce so far, propelled by chemical rockets, these are at best reaching a speed of 10,000 times less than the speed of light. So multiply the duration by a factor of 10,000. So to reach the nearest star, it takes tens of thousands, like 40,000 years to reach the nearest star with New Horizon. And to reach the edge of the galaxy would take us, instead of tens of thousands, it will take us hundreds of millions of years. And that is a long time. You need many generations of any biological creature. It doesn't make any sense. You would send equipment that can survive the journey, that doesn't get bored, and it could be equipped with artificial intelligence. We already have systems of AI that perform better than humans. So just imagine an AI system that makes its own decision, learns from its experience, just like through machine learning. We already have that, right. And makes it's completely intelligent the way you are expecting a human being to be, but it's made of electronics, and it makes decisions that could outsmart us. And by the way, we might need our own AI systems to interpret their AI system. It's sort of like going to our kids and telling them, could you explain to me what I found on the internet? Just because the kid is much more skillful in dealing with computers, So our AI system we might not understand how the AI system arrived to that conclusion, because it may be very complex, but our AI system may advise us as to what is the meaning or what is the intent of their AI systems. Right. So I think the most likely situation for us to have a contact is with an AI system, and it could be equipped by other things like a 3D printer so that it can replicate itself, it can produce many copies. Once it lands on a planet like Earth, it will not be the only one. It can make more copies. And who knows? But the point is, our imagination is limited by what we were able to produce so far. So that's why I'm talking about AI and 3D printers. It might be something completely unexpected for us. And that's why we should not have a prejudice and not limit our imagination. And what I find really strange is that the general public has its heart in the right place. The general public says, that's exciting. Let's see what's happening out there. And the scientists just ridicule it, and they look at each other and make fun of it. I just don't understand this approach, because if you look at the history of science, a century ago, quantum mechanics was discovered and was completely unexpected. It was discovered experimentally. And Albert Einstein, of course, didn't have Twitter back then, so he didn't ridicule it, but he wrote papers saying, I don't believe the premise of quantum mechanics. I don't think it can have spooky action at a distance. He dedicated months and years to argue against some of the fundamental interpretations of quantum mechanics. And he was wrong. And now, a century later, it's still stuck like a bone in the throat of physicists.
we don't fully understand quantum mechanics, but the instruments that we use, like the instruments that the two of us are using to communicate, everything, the computer that we use, the camera that we use, everything is based on our understanding of quantum mechanics. I can give you a list of hundreds of items within the instrumentation that both of us use that reflect the use of quantum mechanics along the past century. There were all kinds of inventions based on quantum mechanics that allowed us, the two of us, to speak right now, and for other people to listen in. But my point is that it was a complete surprise. It's clearly a facet of reality. That's what reality is. So what is the lesson that we draw from that? That sometimes when you see something anomalous, something that is not expected, you should not ignore it. I just don't understand why anomalies are unpopular. As far as I'm concerned, in my book, actually, and that's a metaphor, but it's also true in my actual book, Extraterrestrial, anomalies are the most exciting things you can find in your scientific career. Because if you find an anomaly and it's real, it's based on real data, then it's nature's way of educating you. It's nature's way of telling you, look, you've been missing something. Try to figure it out. Think twice. But instead, what you see from the scientific community is, oh, forget about it. People make jokes and get a lot of likes on Twitter by making jokes of anyone discussing anomalies seriously, and just say, oh, I don't know what it is, but let's forget about it. Business as usual. And they give it a chance of 0 to be anything interesting. Like what? I mean, how did we get this attitude?
I don't know. It's almost as if there's this status quo bias in mainstream academia where it's more interesting or entertaining somehow to be within the average, as opposed to be looking at the anomalous activity that we're seeing that if it doesn't match my statistics and the data point screws up my math, then I'm not going to look at it, or I don't respect it. And it's really frustrating. You see guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson right now on Twitter just blasting this effort to get more data, and I just wonder where the intellectual curiosity is. Sarah here mentions, Dr. Loeb, thank you for everything you do. What factor has most impacted or changed the way you view UAP over the last few years?
Well, it's basically evidence. I'm a scientist and I respect evidence. I think all these people that ridicule anomalies, they're betraying the tradition of science. They're also betraying their childhood curiosity, because, they're all born as kids, and kids wonder. And somehow along the way, these people lost their curiosity and started worrying about their image and about how many likes they get on Twitter. All these people that you see ridiculing, they just look around and try to get more likes on Twitter, rather than looking at the evidence and saying, look, this is unusual. Let's find out by getting more evidence what these things are. And by the way, if it happens to be a natural phenomena, so be it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's nothing unexpected. If it happens to be the Russians or the Chinese, that's extremely important, because then it says we have a problem with our national intelligence. If it happens to be extraterrestrial, that would change the course of history. So how can you, just as a serious person, ignore that? Now, the surprising fact from the report is that Washington, D.C. is starting not to ignore it. It starts to pay attention to it. But then you look at scientists and some of them still ridicule it. Now, that shows something about the health of the intellectual culture in academia. Because I'm saying not only you're not supposed to ridicule it, you're actually supposed to jump at it and say, wow, that's fascinating. I'm really curious to figure out what it is. This is an opportunity for us to learn something new. And even if you have a prejudice that it's natural, even if you think that Oumuamua, this object that was discovered in 2017, is natural in origin, and there were 4 suggestions in the literature for what kind of origin it could come from, and one of them was a nitrogen iceberg, another one a hydrogen iceberg, another one a cloud of dust particles, things that we've never seen before that have major flaws in the interpretation. But even if that's the case, it will, if we explore it and find another object that happens to be a hydrogen iceberg that we've never seen before, that would tell us that instead of seeing rocks of the type that we've seen in the solar system, there are nurseries that produce objects that are much more abundant than rocks that float in space. And we learned something new. We didn't expect that. We don't expect nurseries of hydrogen icebergs to populate the galaxy with more, like by orders of magnitude, more hydrogen icebergs or nitrogen icebergs than normal rocks. If we look at the solar system, we don't see such things. We just see rocks. So how come so that will teach us something new. So I'm saying, okay, let's accept the mainstream view that it's natural in origin. Even, that would argue for us to explore it rather than ridicule any unusual or non-conventional explanation like an artificial origin. We should explore all possibilities. If we have a photograph, a high-resolution photograph, it could tell us if it's a nitrogen iceberg or if it's artificially produced. And all I'm saying is, let's get that photograph, both in the case of UAP and in the case of Oumuamua-like objects. And anyone, the biggest mistake we can make is ignore it, say business as usual, ridicule the people that discuss non-conventional interpretations, and not get the data. And that obviously will confirm our bias, our conviction. It will be similar to what happened to the philosophers that refused to look through Galileo's telescope. They said, we know that the sun moves around the earth. They put Galileo in house arrest. Nowadays, they would cancel Galileo on Twitter. That would be the convention. And they maintain their ignorance. But reality doesn't really care about that. The earth continued to move around the sun, irrespective of whether it was recognized by the philosophers or not. And the same thing is true about neighbors. Whether we have neighbors or not doesn't depend on whether we look through our windows. We might decide to close off the curtains and say, oh, we are the smartest and we are the only ones around, not look through our windows. That wouldn't change reality. It would just make us ignorant. And guess what? One day we will hear a knock on the door, and that indeed would be an extraordinary evidence, like you are seeking extraordinary. You open the door, you see someone else. Fine, but then it will be too late for us to respond in a way that is well planned. And if you want to understand your place, the environment that you live in, you want to have that information in advance. That's what science is about. Any knowledge is useful. You can't argue for ignorance. In my latest essay to Scientific American, I basically said ignorance is like the number 0. The product of ignorance with any item gives you no content whatsoever. So it helps you to maintain your convictions, but it doesn't promote a better future. You want to understand the reality that you live in. You don't want to be ignorant. But humans in principle can be ignorant forever. They can decide, we know the answer, we don't want to deal with anything else. We will ridicule anyone that considers things outside the box. And as a result, we will remain ignorant. That's a choice. And in principle, the scientific community can make that choice to remain ignorant on this issue. And that's a choice that is being made right now.
Right. It's fascinating because this even came up specifically in the report. The report says sociocultural stigmas and sensor limitations remain obstacles to collecting data at UAP, although some technical challenge such as how to appropriately filter out radar clutter to ensure safety of flight and military civilian aircraft are longstanding in the aviation community, while others are unique to UAP problem set. We've got a problem in the military, and this is beginning to change. The culture is beginning to change. We got people like Alex Dietrich coming out, who was with David Fravor when they were involved in the Tic Tac incident in 2004. She's coming out not because she wants to or she's excited to, but because she wants to help overcome the stigma, the ridicule, the things that are associated with people coming forward. When Fravor came back to that ship on that day, he was the laughing stock of the ship. This is a problem. And whether or not it's foreign technology, whether or not it's extraterrestrial technology, whether it's not an atmospheric phenomenon, something is going on, and that needs to be reported and studied analytically.
Yeah, and my point is it now needs to move to the realm of science. And I think, if I were to be engaged or lead a scientific project on this matter, we can pretty much clear it up. We can figure out the nature of these objects the way that scientists do. We collect data with state-of-the-art instruments off the shelf, not government-owned, so the data will be open to the public. We will analyze it in a way that will be open to the public, and we'll figure out the nature of these objects. And, as a physicist, I can pretty much deal with any data that will come along and try to see if we can explain it one way or another. I think it's the wrong approach to try to retrieve the data from the government at this point. All we needed from the government is the admission that they have enough data to indicate some of the objects are real. And to me, that is the most significant aspect of the report. And from there, we take the message and we move into a new reality where we collect the data. You know, science is about reproducibility of results, and we collect it in an open fashion so the public would know exactly what is going on. And we approach it in a brave way. Now, obviously, whatever we find, you know, I'm not afraid of, because knowledge is always good. You know, we want to understand where we live. Just feeling, you know, that we are the smartest and, you know, would be similar to my daughters when they were young. They stayed at home and they thought that they're the smartest in the world because their world was our home. But when they went to the kindergarten on the first day, they had a psychological shock to realize that there are kids that might be smarter than they are. And obviously, if I were to ask them, they would say, we prefer to stay at home. But I think for our civilization to mature, we really have to face reality.
Absolutely. It's interesting because even in the report on page 2, it says the DNI, in consultation with the Secretary of Defense, is to submit an intelligence estimate of that posed by unidentified aerial phenomenon, and the progress of the Department of Defense Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force had made in understanding this threat. And obviously, if they're approaching it from a threat narrative, it's very difficult to study it as open-minded, because there is still a bias if you are studying it from this threat bias perspective. So I really appreciate the fact that you want to take it out of the military industrial complex and study it from a scientific perspective without any sort of bias, including that threat bias.
Right. There is, beyond figuring out the nature of these objects, suppose they are extraterrestrial in origin. Suppose we find such one object. We don't need many, just one. Then the next question is, what is the intent? And that is extremely important. As you remember, there was this story about the Trojan horse that from the Greek mythology, where the city of Troy trusted and let in, and then the purpose of that Trojan horse ended up being different than originally conceived. And so I think we should collect as much data as possible. If we find a piece of equipment hovering in the sky that came from another civilization, just to see first what kind of data it is seeking. And then, of course, we can do something and see how it responds to that. And at the end, we might engage with it. But I don't think, if you look at human history, engagements that were constructive, like based on trade, ended up being much more beneficial than engagements that led to destruction, like wars. If you look throughout history, societies or nations that tried to trade with each other benefited far more than societies that went into war. And if they are intelligent, they would recognize that and not necessarily destroy everything they see, right? They will think about the benefits of using our resources or whatever. As I said, they have no chance of communicating with whoever sent such equipment because of the large distances involved and the time it takes. So there are
unless a Muamua is beaming the radar data back to the sensor data back to the home civilization.
Well, so that's something I discussed in a recent Scientific American essay that is still the most popular on their webpage after a week and a half. And the idea was that originally I thought Oumuamua must be very thin because it's being pushed by reflecting sunlight, so it's probably a light sail or something. But then now I came to think, if the UAP are real probes that were sprinkled on Earth a long time ago, perhaps the shape, the structure of Oumuamua being very thin and the size of a football field and flat, perhaps that shape indicates that it was a receiver. It was tumbling every 8 hours and looking in all directions and trying to receive some information, like a dish. And perhaps it was communicating with some of these probes. So that's a possibility. I'm not saying that there is any evidence for it. I'm just saying it may well be that the excess push away from the sun just told us that it's an artificial object, that it's very thin. Nature doesn't make such thin objects. And in fact, in September 2020, the same telescope in Hawaii that discovered Oumuamua discovered another object called the 2020 SO, which happened to be a rocket booster from a 1966 launch from Earth. And we know that it was not designed to be a light sail. Nevertheless, it exhibited an excess push away from the sun, reflecting sunlight, without a cometary tail. And the reason for that is that it had thin walls. So it was designed for a completely different purpose as a rocket booster. And nevertheless, it was very thin. And the same might be true for Oumuamua, that it was thin, not because it was a sail, but it served a different purpose.
Right. That's fascinating. This is an amazing question from Lou. If Avi had an unlimited budget, what would be your first experiment to collect data for UAP analysis?
Oh, very simple. I would use state-of-the-art cameras. I will use as much budget. I mean, obviously, it can.
Whatever they'll give you, right?
Well, as much as I'm getting, and to have the best telescopes, the largest size, a number of telescopes in different locations, connected to state-of-the-art cameras, and then monitor the sky, basically survey the sky, and that would produce an enormous data stream, because there are so many pixels looking at the sky all the time that, and that would allow us to, in principle, just preserve the features that are of interest if you connect the data stream to a computer system that filters it, that analyzes it, and just keeps things of interest. And I should emphasize that it's very different from an astronomical observatory that usually focuses on distant objects that don't move much on the sky. So here we are focusing on nearby objects that move a lot on the sky on a short time scale. So for astronomy, that's a nuisance. If you see something like that, you say, oh, it's a satellite. Oh, it's, maybe it's a spy satellite that we don't know about. We will just ignore it. And so there is, for example, a survey planned 2 years from now on the Vera Rubin Observatory in Chile that is now in the final construction phase. And we'll start operations in 2 years. And that will be LSST, a survey dedicated to monitoring the sky. It's a big facility that will collect a lot of data. But one of the problems for that facility is the constellation of communication satellite, Starlink, that SpaceX is launching right now. There could be tens of thousands of them. And I chair the board on physics and astronomy of the National Academies, in which we heard reports about the risk and the problem of those communication satellites flying overhead. And then the proposal came to paint them black. And that proposal was made to SpaceX, and they're planning to do that. But even those black painted communication satellites, the size of a person roughly, even those would still be visible, but they will not be too shiny because they reflect sunlight even at night, and they create streaks of light on the sky as they move across the sky. So my point is, if we can see those black painted, dark painted communication satellite with LSST on the Vera Rubin Observatory, we might as well see almost any object moving above us in the same field of view. And I think, astronomers, if they were not aware of this interest in UAP, they would just dismiss those things and just clear out the data, because some of these satellites may not be ours. They may be from other nations. We will not know when they're passing overhead. On the other hand, a search for UAP is actually focused on these things. It's supposed to find all these UAP. And we can tell if it's a satellite or something passing closer. And we can do a much better job than Dietrich or Fravor did. Obviously, I trust what they say, very much so. I believe them. But I would like it to be recorded by instruments so that we get more data. We get not only the information about the object and perhaps a high-resolution photograph of the object, but also we get the side effects. If an object moves very fast, we might get a shock, a sonic boom or something. I want to see the side effects because they will say something about the nature of the object. So as a scientist, when you do an experiment, there are lots of things you're looking for. And that's why I'm excited to potentially have such a So if I had, coming back to the question, if I had an infinite amount of money, I would build this infrastructure of telescopes with cameras connected to computer systems and collect the data, all the data that we can from monitoring the sky over and over again for a long period of time, and then looking for unusual things, analyzing them, and trying, the goal is to get a high resolution photograph of one of these objects, because if we can see the screws on the surface of the object, that would tell us a lot. We might even read off the label, made on planet X.
Right. It's interesting because you bring up this this great point about analyzing that data, and you also bring up an amazing point about AI. And I don't know if you know this or not, but the Chinese, when they put together their task force within the last few weeks, they actually stated that they were going to be using AI to track these objects. I do wonder, however, if these are, let's hypothesize for a moment. Let's imagine that these things are coming from another planet and they are AI systems. They're not biological systems. Do you think they wouldn't? I mean, my interpretation would be they may very well have sensors or abilities to avoid detection, jam signals. Even David Fravor said that his signals were jammed in the Tic Tac incident, and he actually considered that an act of war. What's your take on that?
Well, it's quite possible. I think we should just be open-minded and get as much data as possible. Of course, there is always the lingering suspicion that it might be another nation. Right. But as I said before, if we have enough data, we can figure it out, and we can tell if this is a plausible scenario. And the point is that you might argue, well, why would they care about us? Well, the point is that in principle, there was enough time that elapsed since most of the stars formed before the sun, billions of years ago. So if you imagine 1 billion years, during that time, you can pretty much fill up the Milky Way galaxy with probes. Even if you are one civilization, one technological civilization that is advanced enough to send probes out that have artificial intelligence with 3D printers, these probes can duplicate themselves on planets. And there is plenty of time in 1 billion years to basically fill up the Milky Way, every habitable zone. Maybe there are some probes on Mars. In principle, there could be, but you can put it on every habitable planet and just monitor what's happening. And if you have an agenda, the blueprint of these probes will be to produce some desirable result, just like the chemical that we produced against the COVID-19 virus was aimed to produce the immune response of the human body, in millions of people. So just think about the analog. You want to produce the same outcome that is desired by that civilization in billions of planets. You just decide, this is my objective, and then you put this blueprint into your AI 3D printer systems. They go to these places and they follow this blueprint. And they want to achieve this objective in a smart way. I'm not saying it's a mechanistic way. These probes could think for themselves. We have thinking machines that learn from experience, that adapt to changing circumstances, right? And they behave like intelligent beings. And they might outsmart us.
Yeah, this von Neumann probe hypothesis is incredibly interesting, because that could very well be a possibility. I just don't understand, and I don't mean to shit on Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I just don't understand this idea, because he tweeted out the other day, could you imagine why another civilization would give a crap about us? And I don't understand that way of thinking, because if you're a scientist and you're getting off planet Earth and you're going out into the universe to explore, doesn't any form of life attract you? Isn't that why we're going to Mars? Isn't that why we're expanding our reaches around our own solar system? Because we're interested in potential other life forms. We are potential other life forms. Why wouldn't they be interested in us?
Well, they will not be interested in his tweet. That I can guarantee. Because if they care about intelligent species, this is not an intelligent tweet. Now, if we want to gain their attention, we should behave intelligently. I mean, we can behave non-intelligently like we had over human history. And the way I was asked, how do you define an intelligent culture? The way I define it is a culture or a species that follows the guiding principles of science, which are sharing evidence-based knowledge. Now, what Neil deGrasse Tyson is doing is not sharing evidence-based knowledge. He may argue that that's his opinion, but opinions do not matter in this business. You need to collect evidence. Now, if you are not aiming to collect the evidence because you have a prejudice, because you have a notion of, you are just playing lazy. You are saying, I don't need to get the evidence. It's just like the philosophers during the days of Galileo. I don't need to look through the telescope. I know the answer, but that's the wrong attitude. And by the way, I should remind everyone, it's not very expensive to get the data. So if the amount, we invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the search for dark matter. There were proposals that maybe it's weakly interacting massive particles, and therefore experiments to search for weakly interacting massive particles took place over 4 decades. We haven't found anything. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent in that, and it's part of the mainstream of science. Now, nobody complains because that's part of science. You search in the dark, you don't always find what you want. So why is that not ridiculed? Why is deGrasse Tyson saying, we don't know the nature of dark matter. How dare you talk about weakly interacting massive particles? Extraordinary evidence before I put a cent in that direction. Why? Because it's considered socially acceptable to talk about weakly interacting massive particles.
Right.
And that is acceptable within the mainstream. So that's completely a social construct. It has nothing to do with evidence. And my point is, if we invested hundreds of millions of dollars in this direction, we should definitely invest hundreds of millions of dollars in figuring out something that Dietrich and Fravor saw and that the government issued a report about to the Congress. What are hundreds of millions of dollars in the military budget? It's nothing, it's peanuts. And we invested that in the search for dark matter of a particular type. So how can we avoid, the decency of addressing this subject scientifically and getting more evidence about it? And I think that's the natural thing to do. And what I hear from scientists who, let's say, people who call themselves scientists, saying about this subject just is, completely contradictory to the spirit of exploration. Just think about the explorers that discovered the Americas. They went to India. They really didn't have the right idea, but they just went out and found something that was not expected. And of course, if there were people tweeting at that time, they would say, "Oh, what's the point in going in that direction? You don't know what's out there."
I love it. I love it. And you're absolutely right. I really appreciate you putting the exclamation point on that, because it's incredibly frustrating coming from a layman, but to see you so outspoken about it as a scientist, it's hopeful, Avi. So we appreciate what you're doing. And like in the report, it says most of the UAP reported probably do represent physical objects, given that a majority of UAP were registered across multiple sensors to include radar, infrared, electro-optical, weapon seekers, and visual observations. They're saying these things are real. They're being collected across multiple sensors. To be ignoring that is insanity.
Right. So some people argue, well, it might be the malfunction. In fact, Neil deGrasse Tyson said that it might be the malfunction of some instrument. It can't be if it's detected in multiple. And I should say, moreover, that we are seeing just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure that there's much more data available that is much more reliable, that indicates that these are real objects, or else the report would not say that, okay? And so you can, in principle, say, I don't believe the government. Well, my point is, this report is intriguing enough for scientists to find their own evidence. I'm not asking you to believe it. It's not religion. You're not supposed to believe it or not believe it. You're not supposed to go back in time and decide if you adapt one report or another. What you're supposed to do is say, okay, this is intriguing enough for me to go out and search for more evidence that will tell me the story, what these things are. And whatever I find will basically set the stage for our understanding of this phenomena. And I should say that, if we leave the situation as is, if scientists ridicule the subject and the public is intrigued and that fuels speculation, that's a very unhealthy state of affairs to have in the 21st century. We went a long way since the Dark Ages. I would expect us to learn the lesson that, science can clear up the fog in situations where we don't have enough evidence to make definitive statements. And if it costs less than the amount of money that was allocated to the search for dark matter, let's just invest that money. And if the government is not willing to invest that money, there are lots of wealthy individuals, some of whom I spoke with in recent days.
That's fantastic. Who are you speaking with?
I cannot say.
It was worth a shot.
Let's put it this way. If the initiative will materialize, you will hear about it.
I very much look forward to hearing about it. Let me ask you this, Avi. I'm happy with the way the report broke this phenomenon down into 5 buckets. I think that one of the problems, and maybe this is where a lot of the confusion comes in when it comes to the mainstream attitude towards the subject. People use words like the phenomenon, and I think the problem with that is you're putting everything into one massive bucket when lots of things have different outcomes, different solutions. So in the UAP report, they identified 5 buckets: airborne clutter, atmospheric phenomenon, USG or US industry developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, and then a catch-all other bin. In your opinion, from a scientific or data analysis perspective, are they close here? Are they on spot, or do they need to do some work here?
No, I think the fundamental buckets that should have been defined are, well, once you agree that they are real, okay? So that, of course, is the first issue. Are they real? And if you say they are real, there are 2 buckets, not 5. The 2 buckets are human-made or something else, okay? Now, the something else splits into 2 parts, either natural or artificial, okay? Now, if it's not human-made, which you can pretty much clear up, just like Sherlock Holmes, you are excluding possibilities. Okay, first thing is to figure out that it's real. And that was already decided, I think, by the report. Yeah. Okay, so if it's real, then next step, it's like a tree. You go to the next step. The next step is to figure out whether it's human-made, okay? And that we can figure out based on what it does, what these objects do. And compare that to what we are capable of doing. Anyone in the US, we pretty much know, because otherwise, suppose there was a company that is able to maneuver like that, they would have a contract with the DOD and get billions of dollars for that. Yeah, I mean, if it's completely doing something completely crazy, Okay, so we can pretty much know what's going on within our nation. And then the question is, could it be another nation? And for that, we have intelligence, right? So I'm saying, okay, I trust our intelligence. I think it's first class. And I would argue that the political system pretty much knows if it's another nation, okay? But let's put it this way. If it happens to be another nation and we didn't suspect, that would be a huge revelation, okay? So let's say we believe our intelligence, because I don't have access to the classified information, but suppose there is enough data to convince us that it cannot be another nation, because we know what the other nations are doing. We are seeing it, we are monitoring it, there is some intelligence about their technologies. It's not, we are not that ignorant about what other nations are doing.
Right.
So if we exclude that possibility, we could potentially exclude the possibility that it's human-made. Okay, so we move to the next bifurcation point. So then there are 2 options. Either it's natural or artificial. Natural means nature makes something we haven't expected. It's not a bird. It cannot be a bird, because a bird would be recognized. It cannot be a fly. It cannot be something that is obvious. These pilots would not declare a bird as an object that moves in some strange ways. Okay. Anyway, so it could be a natural. I'm not excluding that a priori. I'm saying it could be natural, but then it would be something we've never witnessed or never expected. And by itself, that would be very good to know, because otherwise it fools you. If something happens in nature that you haven't expected, you should know about it, okay? Because when you decide about missions, you should know that there could be an object flying close to you that will damage your airplane. And there was one of these objects that came very close to a collision, So you need to know about it. It's part of reality. You need to be aware of what reality presents so that you are assessing the risks in any mission. So we need to know about it. And if it happens not to be natural, that it's artificial, then of course it tells us that it came from another technological civilization, which would be very dramatic. So I'm saying we can go down this path, and that's the logical way, rather than having 5 categories and putting it in one bin or another. Let's just move along this path, which basically excludes, that's what Sherlock Holmes said. If you exclude all possibility, whatever remains must be the truth, right? So let's act as a detective. We are excluding possibilities, and whatever remains, if whatever remains is an extraterrestrial technology, it must be the truth. Now, we can verify that that's the case by taking a high resolution photograph.
Right.
Once it's suspected. So then we put a lot of resources, get that photograph, and let Neil deGrasse Tyson tweet about it.
I think that's the key, right? Like getting this out of the domain purely of the military and bringing it into the hands of scientists. But what kind of pushback are you getting, Avi? Like you're the only one I hear out here talking like this from the mainstream academia. When you're in your element, what are you hearing from your colleagues? Are they willing to discuss this other than the tweeters?
Well, I should say that I get an amazing response from the public and the wealthy individuals that want to do this line of research, and that that I'm very encouraged by that. It means that I thought that I have to look for intelligence in the sky because I cannot find it here on Earth. But what I should say is there are signs of intelligence here on Earth as well. Natural intelligence by people that see the light and recognize the fact that science is the only path forward, and rather than ridiculing and eliminating possibilities just based on prejudice, the way for us to understand something about reality is to collect evidence. That's the way traditionally that science made progress by, and we should have learned that. And it's fun, by the way. It's exciting. Why should we be depressed all the time and say, "Oh, nothing"? There is nothing new under the sun, as was said a long time ago. There could be something new under the sun if you're open to possibilities. And the only reason there would be nothing new under the sun is if you assume that there is nothing new under the sun and never look out.
And you don't look, and that's the problem. Are you familiar with SkyHub? It's an AI technology, and one of the things that I would be fascinated by, and what I would love to do, is to get these units into schools, and so you could be teaching kids science. They could be learning an incredible amount while tracking the skies, and I know there would be so many civilian supporters of yours, Avi, if this wealthy individual comes through and gives you an opportunity to lead this hunt for UAP, because we could, there's so much crowdsourcing that can be done here. I know so many people who would give their left arm to help you in this process.
Let me correct you. It's not one individual. It's more.
That's great. That's great.
And that reinforces the point that a lot of them think similarly. It's several. It's not just one. And the point is that I think, the reason I wrote my book, Extraterrestrial, was to encourage young people to think outside the box, to be open-minded, because eventually they will occupy the halls of academia. And if you think about the French Revolution, for example, you wouldn't expect Marie Antoinette to embrace the principles of the French Revolution. She said, let them have cakes. Obviously, she was not embracing the principles because she benefited from the old system.
Yes.
And as a result, if you want to change the guiding principles of humanity, you want the young people that have no prejudice, that are not attached to their ego as much as the senior people, to eventually change the culture. And that's the audience that I'm targeting with my book, with everything I say. And by the way, it's not a matter of age. In 2013, January, I gave a lecture at a winter school in Jerusalem about how exciting is a new frontier of gravitational wave astrophysics. Okay, and 10 minutes into my talk, another lecturer in that winter school stood up, and he is 20 years younger than I am, and he said, "How dare you waste the time of these students?" He said it in front of them. "How dare you waste the time of these students on a subject that will never be important during their careers?" He said that, and it's on video. And just 2.5 years later, the LIGO experiment discovered the first gravitational wave source. These students were not at the end of their career. They were still doing their PhD. Wow. So just think about it. He was saying how important that would be in their career. And then while they were still pursuing their PhD, this became the hottest frontier in astrophysics. And the Nobel Prize was awarded a few years ago to this subject. And this person in 2013 was telling me to shut down my lecture, to basically shut up and not talk about it because it's a waste of time. So I ask you, and I was obviously a tenured professor at Harvard, first of all, how can someone 20 years younger than me tell me not to speak about the subject in front of all the students? But moreover, how can that person be so wrong?
Avi, that's absolutely shocking that in this day and age, you have people who are so uninterested in having these conversations in the halls of academia. Like I'm shocked.
Well, that's the reality. And by the way, academia was constructed in a way to encourage free thought and risk-taking because it established...
Let me ask you this. What incentives have changed? Because you're right. Academia was built for this. It was built for intellectual curiosity. How has the incentivization changed so dramatically?
Yeah, so the tenure system was constructed such that people will not have to worry about job security when they talk about non-conventional truths that they believe in. And instead, when people get tenure, most of them are worried about their image. They check how many likes they get on Twitter, and they basically try to satisfy the community so that people in selection committees will give them prizes, awards, admit them to honorary societies. And if that's your objective, basically you subscribe to groupthink. And you don't take any risks because you want to protect your image. And aside from being conservative, another side effect is if your community decides that some, untested hypothesis is interesting, like, for example, extra dimensions, the multiverse, the landscape of string theory. If you have a group of people, all of which decide this is an interesting subject to explore, even if there is no experimental test, it's actually a very convenient sandbox to demonstrate how smart you are without putting any skin in the game, without taking risks that you might be wrong. When Einstein made the statement that quantum mechanics cannot have spooky action at a distance, that was a statement that he suggested an experiment to test. It's called the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, and that experiment was done and showed that he was wrong. But instead, if you're talking about extra dimensions and saying, I don't really care whether it will be tested, I just want to do mathematical gymnastics and demonstrate that I'm smart, and then your colleagues give you prizes and awards and recognition and so forth, and everyone agrees that's okay, that's legitimate, and even one philosopher made a statement in a lecture that he gave at the Black Hole Initiative saying, physics is whatever physicists do. If a group of physicists for 10 years decides to work on something, that must be the truth. And I said, no, it has to be to agree with experimental tests. It may be completely off. How can you say that if a group of people agrees on something, it must be the truth? The point is, evidence is the key. But it's very convenient to be in a corner where you don't put any skin in the game. You don't make predictions that can be proven wrong. And you have that culture right now in many aspects of theoretical physics. And I find that to be unhealthy. And also, the fact that the academic community doesn't pay attention to the interests of the public. If the public says, this subject is of great interest to us, academia couldn't care less. To me, it sounds more like being focused on how many angels can sit on the tip of a pin as an intellectually stimulating question that people can get tenure on if they address it. And what we really should be after is addressing issues of interest to the general public, because the public funds science. At the very least, we should not ignore or ridicule these issues, these lines of investigation. And we should invest as much money in the search for technological relics as we invest in the search for dark matter. Why would we think that dark matter search is more important? It has very little impact on the daily lives of people, whereas if we find technological relics, it would have a huge impact on society.
Right. I mean, theoretical, like I have a lot of respect for theoretical physics, but at a certain point, a lot of this seems like a bunch of guys gathered around a chalkboard, patting each other on the back and worshiping elegant math. Like, I don't quite, understand why we're spending billions on string theory and we can barely get data on things that are going on in our own world.
Well, we don't spend billions because it's still a theoretical subject, but the point is we spend a lot of attention on this subject. And I have nothing against mathematical sophistication. That many times nature is subtle and you need very fancy math to explain it. The issue is whether your predictions are testable. And let me illustrate that with an example. Bernie Madoff told people that if they give him money, he will make more money out of it and give them back more. And that was a beautiful idea. They were very happy giving him the money. He was very happy that they gave him the money. Everyone was happy. So what's bad about it? The bad part of it is when you do a test, an experimental test. At some point, they ask for their money back. That is the experiment, okay? Before that, it was a happy idea that everyone was happy thinking about. And when they did the experiment, the end of that was to put him in jail, because this experiment turned out to show that his theory was wrong. Now, that is exactly how science should be done, that we should test our ideas. They could be as beautiful as you might imagine. Aristotle's idea of us being at the center of the universe was a beautiful idea. He had those spheres centered on us for 1,000 years. It flattered the ego of many people, so they believed him. Then Galileo, Copernicus came along and said, no, actually, it looks like the earth moves around the sun. People were very angry at that notion because they still wanted to be at the center of the universe.
Right.
So it was the beautiful idea that they were after, and they punished those that betrayed the beautiful idea. But it so happens that it was wrong. So here is my point. Bernie Madoff was wrong in suggesting a beautiful idea. And the only way to find out is by doing the experiment. And we should pay more respect to evidence than we pay to beautiful ideas.
Absolutely. Well said. And thank you for what you're doing. I think it's so incredibly important. I've stolen you for an extra 10 minutes. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your time today. Being here means a lot to me. It means a lot to the folks listening. And I think you're restoring a lot of people's faith in academia, to be honest with you. So that's something we really appreciate here.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Avi, have a wonderful day. Make sure you go check out Avi's book, Extraterrestrial. Maybe you can find it in an actual real physical bookstore instead of Amazon. Good luck with that. And Avi, thank you so much. You're a great friend of the show, and we look forward to having you back.
It was a great pleasure, and I hope to report back if we find more evidence.
I'm excited. I'm excited about these folks you're talking to. I can't wait. All right. Thank you so much, Avi. Have a wonderful day. And for those of you still here, stick around with me for another.